So thank you very much for coming out this evening. I have to say, after the last time we were lucky enough to have James Holland with us, I declared I never thought I'd be that interested in tanks, it turns out. Turns out they're pretty interesting when it comes to it. So the minute I heard of James's next book, I was straight on the email to Penguin Random House requesting you to come back as soon as possible. So I'm so pleased that you could make it. So thank you so much. Just to give you a very quick usual summary of how things will work, we'll do an hour session. Might run over very slightly, I have a feeling.
Oh, hopefully not. Hopefully not.
But there'll be time for questions, and anyone who'd like books, obviously at the end we'll go back into the other building. Quick housekeeping, please turn your phones to silent if you haven't already, and any fire exits is the way you came in. So without further ado, please join me in saying a huge welcome to James Holland.
Well, thank you all very much, and I've got to say, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is by absolutely a long way my favourite bookshop in the country, and it's great to be here. So thank you, Ros, and thank you, Bill, for getting me back. I'm going to start in December the 20th, in fact, 1943, a little town called Ortona, or very near the little town of Ortona, which is small, lovely little corner port on the Adriatic coast, about 2/3 of the way up on the peninsula of Italy, and the scene of a really terrible battle in December 1943, which most people have never heard about. And on the 20th of December, the Canadians are attacking, and they're attacking against a sort of combined force of remnants of the German 65th Infantry Division, the 90th Panzergrenadier, and now elements of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Paratrooper Division. And they've been fighting south of the town. They still haven't quite got into the edge of it, but that's their objective. And then they're trying to get on to Pescara, which is a further sort of 15 miles to the north. And this today is a beautiful landscape. Before they turned up was a beautiful landscape full of kind of vineyards and olive groves and what have you. And there's these weird valleys. So there's the Morro Valley, which sort of cuts in quite steeply across this sort of high plateau overlooking the Adriatic coast. And you get down there and up the other side, on the other side of the Morro, and then a bit further on, perhaps a mile away, there's another sort of great big gorge cut out of the ground, going at 90 degrees to the direction which the Canadians are trying to advance. And then there's another one, and then finally you get into Ortona itself, this really rather lovely little kind of seaside town. And on the 20th of have I got that? Yes, that's right. On the 20th of December 1943. One of the attacking battalions, if you think of a battalion, is about 845 men full strength. One of the attacking battalions is the Hastings and Prince Edwards regiment, known as the Hasty Peas. And one of the guys in it is Captain Farley Mowat, who is the intelligence officer. He's only 21 years old, and he's first seen action in Sicily when they land as part of the 1st Canadian Division on the 10th of July back in 1943. And he is, by this stage, just one of a handful of junior officers still standing from those who landed as part of Operation Husky back on the 10th of July. And truth be known, he's starting to feel it a little bit. And they all are. And this battle has really been the kind of sort of nail in the coffin for him, because they first started attacking on the night of the 5th, 6th of December. So here we are on the 20th. It's 2 weeks later. I mean, when you get to Normandy, for example, later on, it's very rare that anyone be in the front line for more than about 4 days, 6 days, absolutely max. But these guys have all been in for 2 weeks. And they're all absolutely spent. They're completely exhausted. And then on that morning, they're told they have to go in and attack again. Final breakthrough to get into the town, all that kind of stuff. And on that morning, it's a miserable day, pouring with rain, mud everywhere, carnage everywhere, lots of dead bodies, sort of bloated and horrible and starting to stink. And on that morning, his commanding officer, a chap called Bert Kennedy, says, "Squib," that's his nickname, "Squib, I need you to go and find those Sherman tanks that are supposed to be supporting our attack. They're supposed to be with B Company now. Go and get them." So he staggers back across the mud, and he sort of made some ground, and then suddenly there's a sort of screaming sound, and a salvo of Nebelwerfer mortars screams in and lands not too far away. Fortunately, far enough away not to injure him, but not far enough away not to knock him off his feet. And he's blasted through the open door of an old stone shed. and he lands on a body which emits a huge belch, and this is the gases of a bloated corpse emitted as he lands on it. And obviously, as you can imagine, this is just the most horrible, shocking experience for him. And he staggers up, looks around, sees 2 other dead bodies, and then realises there's a 4th person in the room, still alive, leaning against the wall. And there's gore around his stomach, he's bleeding badly, and he's also missing one of his arms. And he's only a young boy, and he realises, Farley Mert realises immediately, this guy's got to be the same age, perhaps a little bit younger, perhaps a little bit older, but kind of similar sort of age. Pale eyes, good-looking boy, but filthy, bloodied, all the rest of it. And the German just looks at him and says, "Have you Wasser? Have you got any water?" And Mert doesn't have any water. He's got a water bottle, but by this stage, it's full of whiskey, not water. And he thinks to himself, well, I can't give it to this guy. He's got a stomach wound. That's the last thing he wants is whiskey. But then he thinks, well, he's probably going to die anyway, so maybe I should. So he undoes the lid, takes out his bottle, puts it to the man's lips. He drinks it, thanks him, and then dies. Mert then gets to his feet, staggers out of this stone hut, still in some sort of shock of what he's experienced. Manages to find the Shermans, gets a lift with them, gets on the back of the Shermans. They rejoin Baker Company, and as he jumps off, he slides off and his feet collapse underneath him and he's out for the count. For how long, he's not sure, but I mean, he comes to pretty quickly. But it's testimony of how much is being expected of these very young men in these increasingly difficult circumstances. It's not just fighting, it's the mud, it's the rain, it's the cold, it's the long nights and the short days, and it's the relentlessness of the fighting. As it happens, the next day they do manage to get they get the breakthrough, and suddenly they're onto the edge of Ortona, and a really difficult battle for the town then ensues. And in actual fact, they have to do, the Hasty Peas a couple of days later are asked to do a flanking diversionary attack around the edge of the town, but the battle for the town itself is for one of the battalions in there is the Seaforth Highlanders, and the chap here reading the prayer book with the tin hat on is Major Roy Durnford. And Major Roy Durnford was actually born in Devon, but then emigrated to Canada, and when the war broke out he joined up and did his bit, and he's the padre of the Seaforth Highlanders, and he's one of these guys who kept a really, really fascinating and beautifully written and evocative diary. And on Christmas Day, the fighting is still going on for Ortona. And he writes in his diary, Jerry sending shells over, the deathly chatter of machine guns, the rumble of falling buildings, the roar of guns. It's pithy, but isn't that just so emotive? I mean, you just get such a sense of this sort of carnage going on. And what he does over Christmas Day is he rotates the 4 companies of the Seaforth Highlanders in and out of this bashed about church, but still intact church on the southern side of the town, and does in turns a sort of Christmas Day service for each of them. But of course, it's not, there's 2 sides to this, and there's the paratroopers, there's the German troops, and this guy's Siegfried Bear. I'm afraid it's not a brilliant photograph, but it's the best I can do. And he's only 21 years old at the time, and he's been ill, but he's recovered, and he's sent forward up to Ortona, arrives at the town in moonlight on the night of the 19th. He too keeps a diary and says, gosh, the Adriatic looks so beautiful with the moon shining on the water and all this sort of stuff. And it's hard not to like these people. I mean, in fact, you can't help do anything other than that. You're very mindful that this is a guy who's writing a diary on that particular day, in that particular moment. And these are his inner thoughts. I mean, he's not, he might be writing it for posterity in so much that, one day he can look back on it. But really, it's a kind of cathartic experience for these guys. It's a time waster. It's a means of killing time. It's a means of getting things off your chest. Anyway, he is a radio man in the 5th Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment. And they're having a very, very tough fight. And the fighting for Ortona is incredibly bitter. And one of the things that the Fallschirmjäger do, defending the town, is they put machine guns at different floors. So you might have, one up here, one down here, on the other side. So you've got what's called enfilading fire. And this is the first time they've got Panzerfaust, which are these sort of a bit like bazookas as well, and mortars, and they can call in artillery and so on. So the Canadians moving, even though they've got some tanks, just bringing in tanks a little bit, Ros. Even though they've got tanks, they are. It's mainly this is an infantry job, and what the infantry are discovering that the only way to clear the street is to go in through the front door of a house, clear it, work their way up the floors, bash through into the next building, work down again, up again, down again, up again, until you've cleared the whole street. And this has to be done across the whole town. And it's an incredibly costly, laborious process, and it causes vast amounts of destruction to the really rather lovely town of Ortona, as you can see from these various photographs here. And what happens to Seafree Bear is on the evening of the 27th of December, his battalion, rather, which should be, a paratrooper battalion is usually about 650 men strong, something like that, is down to just 60 men. That's all that's left from this entire battalion. And the only officer left is Lieutenant Pick. And Lieutenant Pick's just lost his best mate that afternoon. And it's just beginning to get dark. And suddenly they're in this building on the edge of a square, and there's a fountain in the middle of the square. And he suddenly drops his machine gun with a clatter and just walks out. Doesn't run out, walks out to the fountain. Turns back to, and all the guys are going, come back, what are you doing? How can you be, get back now? And he's just lost it. He's just lost it in just exactly the same way that Farley Mowat has lost it. It's been too much. His bank of courage has gone, and it's just, he can't do any more. And he turns to them and says, second window over there, all weapons fire at will. Suddenly there's this cacophony of noise, and above all that, a single shot rings out, hits him in the chest, he falls to the ground. And they can see he's still moving, and of course they can't go and get him. It's not safe to go and get him until it's dark, and then when it is dark, out they go. And pull him back in, and he is just alive, but he dies a few hours later. And that night, they're finally called out and said, right, abandon the town, move north, and the Battle of Ortona is finally over. But it's been a terrible, terrible battle. And I'm going to show you a sequence of slides here, which was taken on the afternoon of the 27th, that same day that Lieutenant Pick loses the plot. And actually it was a non-raining day. It was one of the reasons why they're doing the reconnaissance, is because they can actually see something. And this is coming into the north of the town. And again, I hope you can see clearly enough to see that what this town would have looked like. And you can see that literally every single building is damaged in some way. And here we are coming into the town a bit more, and you can see the damage is getting worse. Here's the southern part of the town. I don't know if you remember that picture of the tank with the big building where I was showing where the Fallschirmjäger were. That's just there, and that building is still there, incidentally. And this is the final picture in this sequence, which is just south of the town. And this is where Farley Mowat was when he was getting blown into a building. Could have been one of these, I don't know. But that's where the hasty peas were, coming up this bit here. And you can just see how pockmarked it is. You can see abandoned vehicles, tanks knocked out, all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's a scene of just pitiful destruction. And unfortunately, the violence in Italy for 1943 wasn't yet over, because on the other side of the leg, on the Tyrrhenian coast, on the western side, the US Fifth Army was fighting. And although it's the US Fifth Army, it had French troops in there, it had British troops in it, as well as Americans, of course. And this is the mountain village of Volley Rotunda. And I can promise you that even to this day, this is seriously remote. I mean, it's really out of the way. And you can't imagine, when you're driving around these very narrow little roads up here, that you can't imagine that back in 1943, this was the scene of a war and such extreme violence. But when the Germans turned up and started preparing a fixed line, which was partly the Bernhard line and partly what became known as the Gustav line, a sort of series of defences running across the width of the peninsula, a lot of the villagers sort of thought, well, we're not safe here, we need to go to the mountains. So a group of them, and it was about sort of 50 of them, went up into this high mountains, well over 3,000 feet. And by the 28th of December, it's the snow on the ground. And what they've done is they've made their kind of shelter it's sort of below one of the highest peaks, and there's a sort of quite a big sort of gorge of a sort of mountain, fast flowing mountain stream coming down, very steep scree slopes on one side, but on the other it's a bit softer, and there's beech trees and big rocks, and you can sort of make a kind of makeshift shelter. And this is where this little tight community are. You know, they've got their sort of fires at night and so on. They've got water from the stream. And they're going back to their villages, of course, to get supplies and things during the day. But actually, they've been getting on okay with the Germans, but suddenly on that morning, everything's changed. And there's new Germans have arrived. They've taken over the positions of a different unit. And there's gunfire in the distance. You know, clearly the front is moving forward a little bit. And their faces are set grim. And one of the mothers, and I don't want to upset you here, but one of the mothers has just given birth to a baby a month before, on the 28th of November, called a Dolorata, which means sorrow in Italian, because of the sort of sorrowful situation in which they find themselves. And she's feeding her child that morning, and one of the NCOs comes up to her and she appeals to him and says, you know, what are you doing? You know, we don't mean any harm and all the rest of it. And he kicks her to the ground, takes out a pistol and kills both her and the baby. And then the machine guns open up, and 42 people are killed there. And when you go there today, it's really difficult to get to. But you know, if you know the man with the key, then you can get through a gate and you can get up there and you can wander around. And these are these huge rocks. You know, the river's just over here. And what they've done is they put little slabs where all the people were killed on the rocks. And it's, you know, as you can imagine, it's incredibly moving. And this is, there she is, Angelina Di Matteo. That's the First Lady. I mean, it's impossible not to stand there and be profoundly moved. And I'm also very struck by the fact that no one's ever heard of the Valley Rotunda massacre. You know, it's sort of erased from the history books, or just never ventured into the history books. And I remember sitting there and just thinking, God, how on earth did it come to this? You know, how was it by the end of 1943 that these kind of scenes were happening, that you were having Ortona, that you were having massacres in the high mountains? I mean, these people meant no harm. I mean, how has it come to this? And of course, you have to go back to August 1943, and you have to go to the end of the Sicilian campaign, and here we are on the northeast tip of Sicily, the Straits of Messina, you know, Scylla and Charybdis of Homeric fame, etc. So here we are. This is Sicily. There's the toe of Italy, and of course the sun is shining and the wine-dark sea is twinkling, and seems like quite a good idea. And from the British point of view, they've been umming and ahhing about what to do after Sicily. So they agreed back in January 1943 that they were going to go into Sicily after they finished in Tunisia. Tunisia was a great victory, completed on the 13th of May 1943. Then go into Sicily on the 10th of July. That's all over on the 17th of August. But before then, it's like, what do we do? Because the main event now is Operation Overlord. This is the cross-channel invasion, which is at this point due to take place in May 1944. This is D-Day, this is Normandy, the following year. And that's the priority. But what can we do with all these huge forces that we've got arraigned in the Mediterranean? Naval forces, air forces, troops on the ground. What can we do that can help Overlord? And is there a case for going into Italy? And Churchill's all for going into Italy because he wants to take Rome, this sort of, you know, the capital city, his ancient capital, the capital of fascist Italy, of course. Fascism has been overturned on the 25th of July when Mussolini's booted out. But even so, you know, he feels it's a really psychologically important, morale-boosting, statement-making victory to take Rome. But there are other reasons for going into Italy, because if you make that intention, then that's going to hasten the Italians' exit from the war. And as it happens, the Italians have made kind of contact with the Allies in the early part of August, before the Sicilian campaign is over. And actually the first face-to-face meeting between the Italians and the Allied negotiators takes place in Lisbon, of all places, on the very same day that the Sicily campaign is over, the 17th of August 1943. So they know it's going to happen, but they don't know when it's going to happen, and this is just negotiations at this point. And if you talk about kind of, well, we're going to invade Italy itself, then perhaps that will, you know, hasten the Italians and get them a bit more focused on the armistice, etc., etc. Then on the other point, you know, you've got the Mediterranean is a big old place, and you know, you've got Italian troops here in Italy, but also Yugoslavia, the Aegean, Albania, you know, that's occupying Italian troops. So if they're out of the war, then the Germans have either got to abandon that area or replace them with their own troops. And there's a very good reason why that isn't going to happen. They're not going to abandon it, because Romania, the Plesty oil fields, is the only place where the Germans have real oil. That's their only source of real oil. All the rest of it is synthetic, incredibly expensive, and oil is the thing they're most short of more than anything else. So that Hitler is simply not going to abandon that. And that's a good thing, because that means they'll draw troops away from the Eastern Front and they'll draw troops away from the Western Front as well. And that's good for Operation Overlord, planned for May 1944. But another thing happens, and that is to do with air power. And air power is absolutely central to the way the Allies, Western Allies, wage war. And it's actually central to their war aims, and it's a key part of the whole picture. And the problem is that August, the Americans make an attack on Schweinfurt and get absolutely hammered. And the reason they get hammered is because it's so far into Germany that they don't have fighter escort all the way. And despite being a flying fortress, and despite having a B-24, which is incredibly well armed as well, they're not well armed enough to avoid the slaughter. And losing 20% of your force on one raid is simply not sustainable. The problem is the Allies absolutely need to have complete control of the airspace over the large swathe of northwest Europe before they can even consider committing to Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion. And the reason you have to do that is because the moment you land in Normandy, the cat is out of the bag, and you need to be able to slow up the Germans from reinforcing that bridgehead in Normandy where you've just landed. And the way you do that is by destroying bridges and marshalling yards and railway lines and roads. And the way you do that is by bombing at very, very low level with smaller bombers and fighter bombers who can get that kind of pinpoint accuracy, which you simply can't get at 20,000 feet with a big heavy bomber. And you can only do that if you have control of the airspace, because the moment you're flying low level, you're incredibly vulnerable to hovering Fokker-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. So you have to clear that. And that is an absolute non-negotiable prerequisite. But if you can't do it from East Anglia, where can you do it? Well, the way you can do it is the Foggia airfields. And the Foggia airfields are here. There's a whole complex of them. They actually go all the way down here. Foggia is about here. And you can see this is one of the very, very few flat bits in Italy. The next bit of flat bit is the Po Valley up here. But look at this huge spine of the Apennines, which goes all the way down into the boot. Very mountainous in the boot here. But the heel of Italy, Apulia, and this area here is actually really flat and perfect for putting big, heavy, four-engine strategic air forces. And it's the Allies and the air chiefs who think, actually, it's all very well going into Sardinia or doing a little foray into there, but actually what would be much better would be to get the southern half of Italy, and particularly the Foggia airfields. And if we can get that, that's a big plus. So the aims are suddenly get Italy out of the war, draw off German troops, yes, take Rome, great, but number one priority, get those Foggia airfields. The problem is they just don't have enough shipping. And shipping is the key to the whole thing. And you think, well, how can this be? You know, the Allies have vast navies, they've got vast merchant navies, they've got all those landing craft. And, you know, when they landed in Operation Husky in Sicily, they had 1,743 assault craft. You know, these are landing craft and whatnot. You know, it sounds like a heck of a lot. The trouble is they don't have those anymore by the beginning of September 1943. And the reason they don't is because a whole load of them have already gone to the Pacific, where there's huge operations going on. A whole load of them have already gone back to Britain because people need training. A whole load of them are now in workshops and dockyards in Malta being overhauled, because when they've been used in Sicily, they haven't just been used on D-Day, on the actual landing day itself. They used the whole campaign, constantly shuttling back and forth from big ships, supplies and stuff to keep the Allied effort on Sicily going. So that they just don't have enough. And by this point, it's a question of prioritisation. And the prioritisation, yes, it was for Sicily, but Sicily's now done and dusted, and now there are other prioritisations. And the big problem is that the Americans and the British went through a big landing craft production phase, but quite late on, because at the start of the war, there was no such thing as landing craft. The Higgins boat, the famous Higgins boat that you see sort of, you know, landing on Omaha Beach or whatever, that didn't go into sort of operations until 1941. They just didn't exist at the start of the war. And the Americans alone produced 8,719 assault craft between the beginning of April 1942 and the end of May 1943. And that sounds like a heck of a lot, and it is a heck of a lot, but it's not enough for what they all want to do. And what you really want if you're going to go into Italy is lots and lots of landing craft so you can outflank all those mountains and just work your way up the leg in a series of amphibious operations. But they don't have enough. And in fact, all they've got for what they're planning now is to do. They've crossed this Rubicon. They've psychologically made the move. They're going to go into Italy. It's decided. Foggia, the little sort of the carrot, the tantalising kind of bunch of grapes that is represented by Foggia, is too inviting, and they can't. They're going to do it, come what may. So what they've decided is that on the 3rd of September, they're going to do a small little foray into the boot, and hopefully draw off some German troops. And then 6 days later, and that will be Operation Baytown, but it'll be a small operation. And then 6 days later, they'll do their main operation, which will be Operation Avalanche. And this will be along the beaches south of Salerno, which is about 20 miles south of Naples. So much further up the boot. And that is the plan. But what they've also done is they've convinced themselves two other factors. The first one is that Hitler plans to move his German forces to the Pisa-Rimini line. Now, Pisa is on the western side, Rimini is on the eastern side, and this is about 200 miles north of Rome. And this nugget of information is based on two things. One, a decrypt of German radio traffic back in May 1943, and we're now, planning this in August, so quite a long time afterwards. And the second thing is talking to General Castelloni, who is the chief negotiator for the Italians, who says, yes, absolutely the Germans are planning to move to the Pisa-Rimini line. But can you trust him? I mean, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he wants the armistice to happen. He wants the Allies to come and rescue Italy. But the Allies convinced themselves that this is going to be the case. The other part of the negotiations in the armistice is that when they do their main landing, they will announce the armistice just before. And when the landing happens, the Italians will turn their guns on the Germans and not surrender themselves to any of the German forces. And again, you're looking at the Italians in the Second World War and you're looking at their track record, you'd have to say that seems a quite unlikely scenario. But on this basis, the green light is given to both Baytown and to Operation Avalanche. And it's quite a punt, to put it mildly. So what are the Germans thinking of all this time? Well, their preoccupation is with the fact that the Italians are going to come out of the war. They know this is going to happen. They're all pretending it's not, but each side knows that it is. It's a sort of great unsaid, unspoken thing. And they are planning for the complete disarmament of the Italian forces. Just as the Allies predicted, they're absolutely planning to go into the Balkans, absolutely planning to go into Greece and the Aegean, and certainly into the northern part of Italy. And they're going to disarm all the Italian armed forces and send them back to Germany as much needed slave labour. That's the plan. And there's two schools of thought about this. Do you defend the whole of Italy, or do you cut your losses and think, actually, it'd be much better to have much shorter supply lines and just move back to the Pisa-Rimini line as first mooted back in May? And a big advocate of the shorter supply lines is Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who has had plenty of experience of fighting against the Allies and knows what their air power is like, and is very much in favour of not having to battle their way down through the leg of Italy and using narrow roads and railway lines and all the rest of it. He wants to keep it as short as possible. And actually Hitler, by this stage, in the middle of August, beginning of September, is very much of the same thought as it happens. So he is in charge of Army Group B, and he's got 11 divisions. And divisions are the unit by which we judge the scale of armies in the Second World War. And if you think about kind of sort of 15,000 men, you're not far off it. That's a sort of rule of thumb. There's some which are bigger, some which are smaller, but that's as a sort of benchmark. Down in the south, there's 8 divisions, plus sort of extra troops and stuff, supply troops and what have you, under Field Marshal Kesselring, who's a Luftwaffe Field Marshal, but he is commander of Army Group C, despite his Luftwaffe background. And he is absolutely determined that should the Allies land, he is going to defend southern Italy and push them back into the sea, as well as disarm the Italian armed forces. So that's what they're thinking, and they're kind of expecting at any moment. But really, really ironically, Hitler actually, by the beginning of September, when the Allies, so 8th Army do go across the Straits of Messina on the early hours of the 3rd of September, and at that point, Hitler has one of his hissy fits and goes, you know what, I'm utterly fed up with the Italians. They're faffing about. They're not making up their minds. I'm going to make up their minds for them. They can have the whole of southern Italy. I can't be doing with it. I'm going to retreat to the Pisa-Rimini line, and I'm going to tell them this on the 9th of September. And on the 9th of September, we're going to absorb the whole of northern Italy into the Third Reich. And you know what? The Italians, they can just lump it. That's what's going to happen. Of course, what he doesn't realise is that there are plans afoot for the 9th of September from the Allies. So this is German troops pouring into the northern Italy. This is part of Rommel's forces. There is a sort of late entry division, which is the 44th Hocken-Deutschmeister division, which comes in down the Brenner Pass, and the Italians sort of complain about this, but what are they going to do about it? The other point is that the Germans are hogging all their fuel, they're hogging all their ammunition, they're hogging all the supply lines, and the Italians are feeling really, really bereft. They're feeling like, they've got lots of troops, but they're underpowered, they're under strength, they haven't got enough ammo, they haven't got enough fuel, etc., etc., etc. And actually this slide is quite interesting because this is the Pisa-Rimini line. You can see it is a really, really long way up. And this is where I think that for all Rommel's good sense for cutting their supply lines, it's very atypical of Hitler to sanction a major withdrawal. And if you're the Allies and you look at Hitler's track record and his constant changing his mind and defending things to the nth degree and all the rest of it, I would have put very, very little credence on him doing that. That's not just being wise after the event. And what about the Italians? Well, they're in an absolute kind of blue funk of the whole thing. I mean, they're between a rock and a hard place. The Italian people can no longer cope with excessive Allied bombing of their cities, which is what's happening. They know that the whole Italian population has absolutely had it up to here with the war. They're done. The morale is shot. But they also fear the retribution of the Germans. And these guys, the commanders, particularly fear the retribution of the Germans in terms of being captured and promptly executed. So up here you've got Vittorio Ambrosio, who is the commander-in-chief of the Comando Supremo, which is the combined chiefs of staff. This is the kind of military machine. Down here you've got Pietro Badoglio, who is the new prime minister after Mussolini was deposed. Up at the top, the kind of mafioso thug is Mario Ruato, who's in charge of the army. You've got Giacomo Carboni in the bottom right there, who is the head of intelligence, SIM, and also in command of Italian troops around Rome, defending Rome. And here you've got the king, and people often forget this, that all during the fascist era, from 1922 onwards, Italy remained a kingdom, and he is the king, King Victoria Emmanuel III. And they get it into their heads that the Allies are going to land sometime after the 12th of September, and there is no reason for this whatsoever. And the reason, of course, that the Allies, after the armistice is signed, which it is finally signed on the afternoon of the 3rd of September, they tell the Italians, right, we are going to do a major landing elsewhere in Italy, but we're not going to tell you when it is, but we will suddenly tell you when you have to announce the armistice, and immediately after that is when the landing is going to take place. And the Italians go, well, can't you give us a bit of a hint here, roughly? And they go, no, we're not telling you where or when, but it will be within the next 2 weeks. And so the Italians take that as it will be in 2 weeks, or certainly 10 days at least. There was no basis for this whatsoever at all. This is how they assume it. And so suddenly on the 8th of September, Wednesday the 8th of September, it's suddenly announced that the armistice is going to be delivered that night, first by Eisenhower, and then Badoglio is going to have to do it. And they just absolutely lose the plot completely because they're just not expecting this. They go, but we're not ready. We haven't got enough ammunition. We haven't got enough men. We can't do anything. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And basically, they all start doing their exit plans. The only person who's trying to kind of show a bit of backbone is Carboni in the bottom right here, who says, what we should be doing, and he said this a couple of days earlier, is what we should be doing is sending out a message to all our troops saying, if the Germans ever try and attack us, we are to resist. And all these guys go, yeah, absolutely, of course we're going to do that. In actual reality, what they do is quite the opposite. They ignore Carboni's missive, don't tell him, and secretly, they tell all the armed forces throughout Italy and the Balkans and elsewhere, they say, if the Germans attack you and open fire, do not retaliate. And the reason they say this is purely to save their own skins. So what happens is the announcement is made on the evening of the 8th of September, shock all around. Germans are absolutely livid. Operation Axis, their plan to disarm the Italians, goes into action immediately. And in the early hours of the morning, these guys, except Carboni, all flee Rome. And history has not been kind to them, and quite rightly. I mean, it is absolutely morally bankrupt, cowardly, feckless, terrible thing that they did. But that's the way it is. So here we are in the boot. This is where the tow, and of course the only reason they only send over a very small force, and the reason they only send over a very small force is because they've only got 268 landing craft. Again, that may sound like quite a lot, but it isn't when you've got a division is using 3,000 vehicles each. So 2 divisions is the maximum they can sustain. It's not a question of getting men over the Straits of Messina. It is maintaining them and sustaining them once they're there, with ammunition, with fuel, with food, with everything you need to protract the war. And again, just to remind you, for Husky, 1,743. For Baytown, 268. It's not enough. And what 8th Army do discover very quick order is that the rear guards of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, the engineers of that unit, have blown up every bridge there is, every mountain road, every pass, and getting through those mountains is incredibly difficult and slow and just time-consuming. So here we are suddenly on the kind of, the early hours of the 9th of September. Operation Avalanche is going to happen any minute now on those landing beaches south of Salerno. And this is Mark Clark, who is the commander of the US 5th Army, which is given the responsibility of that landing. And Clark is an incredibly experienced planner, trainer of men, organizer. He's completely brilliant. He's pretty fearless. He's shown his bravery a number of times, not least in the First World War, where he wins the Distinguished Service Cross. And he's a very competent man. But there is no question about it that he has been given a very bad hand. Now, the whole way the Allies are protracting their war from August 1942 onwards, once the British retreat to the Alamein line, is they decide no more reverses, no more retreats. From now on, we really stack it before we do anything so that we're minimising the risk, so that we don't spill blood over the same ground twice. And that's an incredibly sensible attitude. And that has been absolutely the forefront of all plans ever since then. But with Avalanche, they've abandoned that. Because of the lure of the Foggia airfields, because all the chiefs of staff, combined chiefs of staff have got behind this operation, they want to do it, but they don't want to commit enough assault craft to it. So they're going in undercooked. And of course, he hasn't commanded troops in battle since 1918, and now he's an army commander. So he just doesn't have that experience. For all his other experience, low battery. Very happy to do it without slides, if you like. So anyway, I'll just keep going. So they land, and the beach itself is. Let me quickly put a slide on so you can get it. So here, this is mountains. You can see it's mountains all around there. And you've got a sort of semicircle of flat land here. This is the beach. This is Salerno here. Down to Agropoli there, it's about 30 miles. But because of the shortage of landing craft, they've only got 359 on this instance. They've only got 359. What that means is he can only land 1 division here. He's only got enough to land 1 division here and 2 divisions here, 2 British divisions. Then he's got a handful of commandos and US Army Rangers to secure the passes into the mountains, which are going up to Naples, which is sort of up here. That's all he can afford on that one operation. Facing him is the 16th Panzer Division. And although that's only 1 division and he's landing 3 plus sundry extra troops, and he's got a 4th division, the 45th, waiting, that is still an incredibly big ask, because the Germans have got control of all this high ground. And when you've got control of the high ground, that means you can see everything that's happening. You can see everything that's happening on the ground, every troop movement. And it also means you can have observers up there who can direct artillery fire onto the invasion. And if I just show you here, this is the landscape. This is Salerno, and this is the hills just south of it. This is where 46th Division, the British 46th Division, are going to land. I mean, look at those hills there. If you can, if it's not giving you... These hills, I mean, that just says, put some amazing Zeiss Icon optics on the top of it. I mean, that's what it says. I mean, that is a terrible place to attack. I mean, everyone was getting in a kind of, blue funk about Omaha Beach with bluffs that kind of, 100 foot high. Look at those boys. I mean, it's an absolute shocker. This is Paestum. This is the ancient Greek city here. You can sort of see the walls going around there. And here is Monte Cicciarali there and Monte Soprano up here. This is where the Texans are going to land. There's a massive gulf of 15 miles between the southernmost British troops and where the Texans are planning to land. And you think, well, they can't mutually support, which they absolutely can't. There's also a big river, the River Selle, in between them, which is dividing them. But Clark doesn't have any choice, because what he really needs is to get his own troops onto that high ground as quickly as possible. So the further you are away from the high ground, the more flat ground you've got to take before you can get to the high ground, which is why they're so far apart. And what he's hoping is that he's got enough landing craft to then land the 45th Thunderbird Division, the 4th Division he's got, overnight on D-Day and D+1, i.e. the 9th and 10th of September. See this saddle here? This is Monte Cicciarali there. This is from that there, looking over, and that is the plain of Salerno. This is where they're landing. And just trust me, that is a nightmare. From an attacking force, that is a really, really tough ask, because everyone, the Germans, can see your every movement. This is the Amalfi Coast there. And here is this is the beach where the 56th Division, British 56th Division land. Again, there's the Amalfi Coast, so sort of Salerno's just off-piste here. And this is the Texans landing during D-Day. There's a Torre de Paestum, which is a Crusader fort. But you can see, I mean, look at that hill there. I mean, honestly, if you're landing there, you're landing in darkness, which is good because the enemy can't see you, but it's bad because it brings lots of confusion and mayhem, which it absolutely does. And then suddenly dawn comes and you're there. And the eyes of the enemy are upon you. And that's a very, very bad situation in which to be. And this is them landing, and this is really interesting because you can see this little antline of landing craft. This is taken on D-Day. This is, when I say D-Day, I mean D-Day for Avalanche, on the 9th of September. And you should have, these are multiple, there's 4 beaches, invasion beaches here, that they've divided up for the Texans, but they're only going into one bit, and that's because that's the only bit that's secure at that phase. So there's a massive bunch up here, which again is not ideal. This is another picture of the Paestum from above, and then this is where 56. This is 46th Division here, 56th Division here. Can you see this sort of big column of smoke? That is a landing craft tank, which is about sort of 50 meters long landing craft, that has been hit and is on fire. And if you look at this picture here, you see that's the same smoke, and that's taken on the 9th of September. Now, Kesselring's plan is for the 16th Panzer Division to hold the attack on the first day and the second day as long as they possibly can. Hold that high ground as much as they possibly can. Contain the invasion. Don't let the Allies get too far inland. And then throw everything he can from his other sources, pour them towards Salerno, and kick the Allies back into the sea. And Carbone's troops do actually put up a bit of a fight in Rome, and there's a popular insurrection as well. But even so, the German forces are overwhelming, and by 4:30 p.m. on the afternoon of the 10th of September, it's all over in Rome. The Germans have got it, Rome has surrendered, and what that means is that all his other troops can now focus on Salerno. So he leaves the 2nd Fallschirmjäger in Rome to hold Rome, and everyone else is sent to Salerno. So you've got the 16th Panzer there, 29th Panzer Grenadier. They're told to disengage from 8th Army in the boot and hurry up as quickly as they possibly can to Salerno. The 26th Panzer Division, which has been on the other side of the coast, that is told to hurry up and get across the leg and get to Salerno. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier is sent down from Rome. The 15th Panzer Grenadier is sent down from the Naples area. So too is the Hermann Goering Division. Suddenly, that's a heck of a lot of divisions. That's 6 divisions now hurtling either there or heading to Salerno, plus units from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, which is the division that is holding Apulia, that flat bit in the heel. So taking that last division, those last troops he's got in the southeast of Italy, they are all, part of that division is also being sent to Salerno at the same time. And by the 12th of, by the afternoon of the 12th of September, which is obviously D+3, Mark Clark and General Alexander, the Army Group Commander, and Dwight Eisenhower, who is the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, all of them realise that they are, a major German counterattack is imminent, and they haven't got enough troops. And the fighting in the beachhead is pretty bitter. Here they are, there's some mortar teams in the vineyards. But I mean, look at this. I mean, this is just a horror story because you just can't see. You don't know when you're advancing through those vineyards. You can't see very far ahead. The Germans have still got the high ground. And you don't know when a machine gun's suddenly going to open fire. You don't know when mortars are suddenly going to rain in. I mean, just imagine, it's the fear of the unknown, isn't it, that is the worst thing. I mean, just imagine how your heart would be pumping and adrenaline surging as you're being asked to fight through this. It's really, really tough. And by the afternoon of the 12th, every single battalion in all those divisions is committed. And that is something you never want to be in that situation. You always want to have something in reserve. But they don't. Everything they've got is being flung into the battle. And there's a sort of crisis meeting on the afternoon for the Allies, and they kind of think, well, what are we going to do about it? Because you can't just sort of, the loading tables have all been worked out long in advance, and you can't just click your fingers and suddenly go, okay, right, we're going to change everything and get a division from Sicily across. It doesn't work like that. It takes days to organise these things. So they think, okay, well, right, we're going to have a maximum effort from the air forces. We'll bring the heavy bombers can come over as well. We'll hurriedly get some more warships up there. We'll get there's 18 landing ships, which are the biggest assault craft they've got, which are due to go back to England, and they're in Algiers, and they get diverted back to Salerno. But there's this big question mark: will it be too late? And sure enough, on the afternoon of the... I must show you this. This is just an amazing sequence. So this is again, I think, is a very, very vivid sequence of photographs to tell you the kind of fighting you're talking about in the main bridgehead around Salerno. So this is a salvo of artillery and German artillery shells coming in. This is the first one. You can see it's just landed. They're hurtling out of the back of the Jeep. There's the second one, really getting pretty close here, and this one literally on top of them. I mean, it's pretty gut-wrenching stuff. It has to be said. Anyway, what they do is the Germans launch their counterattack on the afternoon of the 13th, and they come down multiple different routes. But the main armoured thrust, which is a combination of the 29th Panzer Grenadier, the 26th Panzer, and the 16th Panzer. So these are units which are suddenly being cobbled together without any kind of reconnaissance whatsoever. But, time is pressing. They've got to get on with it. They start merging down, and they come down to try and split the Allied forces in two. And what they want to do is get on the southern side of the Selle River. And this is all fine. And this is the main thrust here, coming in here. This is Clark's headquarters. This is the Selle River here, but this is the Calore. I don't know if you can really see it. It's a bit difficult. It's a bit faint, isn't it? But just take my word for it. What's really interesting about it is when you actually go there, you can see why the German counterattack doesn't work. And the main reason is because they get on the southern side of the Selle, and suddenly the Calore comes in as well. And what they're planning to do is cross the Calore and sweep into this southern bit, clear up the Texans here, and then move back this way along the coast. The problem is where the Calore joins the Selle, the banks are really deep. The water's not particularly deep, but the banks are really deep. It's completely unfordable. There is no way you can send a vehicle on there, and they haven't got the bridging to do it. And what happens is they're stuck. They suddenly find themselves, we can't move. So there's this massive German armour, half-tracks and assault guns and tanks and what have you. And what Clark has done is managed to galvanise every kind of cook, desk waller, a truck driver, and given them a rifle. But what he's also managed to get is 2 field battalions, which is 48 guns. And he's put them on this road just down here. It's this road here. And what happens? It's this road here. And what happens is they're slightly elevated, and they are field guns, so they're lobbing shells, as opposed to anti-tank guns, which is direct fire, high velocity where you can see the enemy and you're just firing it straight at it. These are lobbing, so it's what's called indirect fire. And the Germans are in this V, and they can't move out. They're stuck. They have to reverse, but they can't. They can't get across the river. They can't get any further south. And they can't elevate their guns because the field guns, the American field guns, these 105s, are on this slightly higher level. And in about 2 hours, late on the afternoon of the 13th, they lobbed 3,700 shells into this mass of German armour. So although they're only a mile and a half or so from Clark's headquarters, they might as well have been 20 miles. They were never, ever going to do it. And the long and short of it is that that night they were able to land a whole regiment, which is like a brigade, 3 battalions, of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. They then do another 2 parachute infantry regiments the following night. More warships turn up. There is this maximum effort of the air forces. And the Germans are forced to give way and push back. And slowly but surely, the Allies actually do manage to win the day. And on the morning of, at about 6:15 a.m., on the morning of the 17th of September 1943, Kesselring does order a full retreat back to the Volturno line, which is about 25 miles north of Naples. And what that means is that the Allies are able to sort of push on. More troops land, overwhelming numbers. You know, that moment, that chance for the Germans to push the Allies back into the sea has gone. So few from the Allies' point of view. And actually, my own view is that Mark Clark, who is often sort of given quite a bad press, I think has done really, really well. You know, he's marshalled his troops incredibly well. He's shown absolute imperturbability. He hasn't panicked. He hasn't got in a flap. And yes, for all the kind of offshore naval guns supporting and all the air power that's been supporting them, really the decisive battle has been on the ground with those infantry and armour and artillery of those divisions that have been landed in the first wave. And it's them that that really deserve that victory. And of course, Clark for his leadership. But of course, the problem with the very sort of heavy firepower approach that the Allies have is that this causes a huge amount of destruction. And it's great in North Africa, where you've got vast, wide open deserts and not a lot of people. But in Italy, where you've got 40 million people and 40 million people crammed into comparatively small pieces of ground because there's not many people in the mountains and in pretty narrow corridors, which is exactly the same corridors in which the Allies are trying to advance, that caused a problem. This is a building which is still there, that is a shell from the Salerno battle, and it's still standing just about. And the scale of destruction and the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding just in the Salerno area is absolutely horrendous, as this picture shows. And this one here is even more affecting, which is, you know, look at the mother with her hand to her face and, you know, the Tommy looking over the sort of wreckage of her house. I mean, it is absolutely appalling. Battipaglia, completely destroyed. Eboli, largely destroyed. Altavilla, completely destroyed. You know, and so it goes on. I mean, these places are absolutely, totally leveled. Towns, villages, which for centuries have been largely untouched, are now absolutely flattened by the kind of typhoon of war. But both Kesselring on the left here and von Vietinghoff, who is the commander of the German 10th Army, which is part of Kesselring's forces, have really overplayed their hand because they put all their eggs in one basket. They've shoved everything into winning Salerno. The idea was to shove the Allies back into the sea, then turn back on 8th Army and wrap up the whole of the southern Italy again. But unfortunately, they left the Fallschirmjäger and an understrength Fallschirmjäger, because some of those Fallschirmjäger units were sent over to Salerno as well, to do all the hard yards in Apulia in the southeast. And they can't do, that's not enough to be able to defend Apulia. And what happens is the Allies realise that actually Taranto, which is in the heel of Italy, a major port, is basically wide open. And it looks like there's hardly any German troops there at all. And so they go, well, great, we don't need assault craft to get into Taranto because the port is still intact, so we can just send ordinary ships. We can send warships to Taranto. So the British 1st Airborne Division is landed the same day as Avalanche on the 9th. Of September, Operation Slapstick, and it's a good total success. And the poor old Fallschirmjäger have got nothing. What can they do? You know, they can do a few rear guards and they can sort of blow up some bridges and lay a few mines and all the rest of it. But that is all they can do. And you can see them kind of moving up here through this area here. This is their progress, and it's pretty easy because first of all they get Taranto, then they get to Bari, then they get to Brindisi. Suddenly they've got 3 ports. And so instead of having to land people with assault craft, you can sail people around and land them here and just send straight into the port. And what that means is that on the 27th of September 1943, Foggia is abandoned. All those airfields are abandoned, and there it is. You know, this is precious fuel which has been spilt. You know, the Germans can't afford to lose any fuel at all, let alone kind of, you know, spill it themselves. And so 3 of the main objectives of Italy have all been achieved before the end of September, which is a pretty good result. You know, Italy's out of the war. Yes, the Germans have had to send lots of troops away from the Eastern Front and the Western Front. And, most crucially of all, they've got Foggia as well. But they haven't, and here we are, just a reminder of where Foggia is, we're talking about here. So it's this bit. This is the bit that Kesselring has effectively abandoned. And this is the most important real estate south of Rome. and it's been abandoned without a fight. And the reason it's been abandoned without a fight is because he's thrown all his eggs in one basket at Salerno, which you would have to say has been a failure because they haven't pushed the Allies back out into the sea. So what happens is Naples falls on the 1st after another popular insurrection of 4 days, the 4 days of Naples. But the city is very, very badly bashed around. It's been bombed over 175 times just by the Allies alone in 1943 and 200 times since the start of the war. As the Germans retreat, they blow up the ports, they blow up the power stations, they destroy the sewage systems and so on. I mean, it's an absolute carnage. And again, there's a massive humanitarian crisis because Naples is the 3rd largest city in Italy of around 900,000 people. And, that's a lot of people not to have food and no running water and no running electricity and all the rest of it. And it's interesting, actually, because here they are coming in, but this chap in the centre is a chap called Wilhelm Maus, and he keeps a very detailed diary, and he is the chief medical officer of the 14th Panzer Corps, part of the German 10th Army, part of Kesselring's mob. And he says, I can't help feeling a little bit sorry for the Italians, but, the truth of the matter is we've got to slow up the Allies and by killing all their animals and destroying all their infrastructure and blowing up their bridges and power stations, that does slow up the Allies, which it absolutely does. And then he says, on the other hand, of course, they did stab us in the back. So, kind of what do they expect? And it's fascinating seeing all these diaries. And one of the things I've tried to change in my approach since doing the tank book, Brothers in Arms, is to actually write completely in the moment. So no forward projection whatsoever, and try and use as much as I possibly can contemporary sources. In my books, I like to kind of follow a quite tight cast list of characters that the reader and myself can kind of get to know and get to sort of empathize with. And having those in the moment diaries and letters is just really, really moving, I have to say. And the thing about Maus is he's a very cultured man, he's a very learned man, he's obviously very bright. I mean, he's an absolute Nazi, there's no question about it. But he is not without humanity. I mean, you would think that's a sort of contradiction in terms, but it isn't. And it's just fascinating. Martin Purple over there is a Fallschirmjäger. He's he's trying to make sense of the mayhem in Apulia as they're retreating, and he just thinks, who are these idiots who are telling us to do this? This is absolutely insane. Why are we abandoning this? But also at the same time making incredible, astute observations about the landscape in which he finds himself. Here, it's not a very good picture, I'm afraid, but this is Jörg Zellner, who writes just an incredible diary. He's a battalion commander in the 44th Hocken Deutschmeister Division, and his diary entries are full of sadness, wistfulness, dark humour, regret. He's constantly worrying about his family back in Regensburg. He sees a ruined village in Italy and he thinks, gosh, is this what's going to happen to Germany? Which of course it is. And he's cursing the war, saying, the idiots who are kind of who are protracting this. But at the same time, he kind of thinks, well, what else can I do? Because I've got to protect my family. This is the only way I can is by fighting it, however senseless it is. Profoundly, profoundly moving. And looking at the same sort of, you're looking at the same with the Allies as well. On the right here is Laurie Franklin Vale. He's actually an Australian journalist from Melbourne, but married an English girl called Olive and ends up fighting with the Fogs, who are the Royal Irish Fusiliers. And officers had to self-censor their own letters, which meant they very often didn't censor them at all. And his letters are, because he's a journalist, they're beautifully written. I mean, absolutely beautifully written. And they're utterly heartrending, worrying about his wife, worrying about his 3-year-old daughter, explaining the kind of the actions he's been in. The letter where he's describing his best friend, his absolute soulmate in the battalion and in the company, bleeding out on him on the battlefield in the middle of the night in a sort of muddy field on the Adriatic coast. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. This is Filippo Caracciolo, who is a Neapolitan. He's very into the kind of sort of post-fascist politics. Again, very acute observations and trying to make sense of the kind of absolutely bonkers world in which they're finding themselves in. The sort of lack of infrastructure in Italy. I mean, we think that the kind of the sort of bad ferries to the Western Isles is a problem, but try going to Naples in 1943. And down here is Harry Wilson, who's a cipher clerk. He's actually Irish, but in the 8th Indian Division. So you've got Franklin Vale, who's Australian, in an Irish battalion, and you've got an Irishman in an 8th Indian Division. His cipher clerk doesn't want to be there, not interested in being a soldier. Very, very funny diary. I mean, very perceptive, just hilarious, and brings some much needed light relief, I've got to say, to the whole thing. But at the beginning of October, they've got these three objectives, but they haven't got the fourth, of course, which is Rome. And also it started to rain, and it started to rain really badly, and it rains 50% of the time between the 1st of October to the end of the year, which is incredibly debilitating for the Allies. And General Alexander does his briefing and his assessment at the beginning of October, and he says, look, we've got Foggia now, but we're going to have to protect it. The last thing we want to do is invest everything in Foggia, and then the Germans counterattack. So we need to be at least 50 miles north of Rome. And the Allied Chiefs of Staff accept this, and there's a very easy way to make this happen, which is to have lots of assault craft there and outflank it, but they don't have that. And the Chiefs of Staff are not willing to provide it. And so suddenly it's getting into a massive slogging match. The rain, the shortening days, the German demolitions in the mountains. I mean, look at that. I mean, it tells you everything you need to know. And look at this. I mean, just imagine having to build this. And all the supplies you've got for bridging or building a huge new bridge or whatever it might be has to compete with the supplies for the ground forces as well. So it ends up being, one of the great USPs about the way the Allies fight is that they use this huge amount of firepower, they use a huge amount of air power. But when you've got 10 tenths cloud, that doesn't work. And when you've got Strada Bianca, these sort of dirt roads, which are used to having mules and carts and the occasional Fiat Topolino, but not 3,000 heavy vehicles of an infantry division times 10, you've got a problem on your hands. And what that means is the only way you can go forward really is by firing your artillery a long way away, and for the infantry to have to do all the hard yards, the poor bloody infantry, the PBI. I'm going to skip that slide, but this one here, I mean, just look at this. I mean, that is the terrain over which they're fighting. They're not trained for this. They've just come from the Western Desert, or they've come from Northern Ireland or England or something. I mean, it's absolutely hopeless. This is the Americans moving up. They get across, get up to the Volturno. Here is the Volturno here. This is, again, just a beastly place to have to cross. The Germans are on this side. They've got OPs here, observer posts, and forward positions here. This is all just mud. You can't get a tank across that or a vehicle across that. Again, this is just infantry job. This is the Tefisco Gap here. So the Americans are coming off this mountain, having to move across here. Hardly any room for manoeuvre at all. Actually, they do it in 2 days and do it very, very well. But even once they've got past that, they're then up to the upper Volturno, and they've got to get to this. And this is the Bernhard line, the winter line. And just behind it is a second, this is sort of like a double lock on a safe. You've got the Bernhard line, right behind it you've got the Gustav line, which is the one that goes through Monte Cassino, etc. So they've got to get across here. This is Venafro, there's Monte Sammucro, there's Monte Corno. And the only way they can get the Germans off this is by going up into those mountains and prizing them off it. And let me explain to you why. This is the approach to, this is the line, and this is them moving up here. And you can see it's just mountain, mountain, mountain. This is the main access north for the US Fifth Army on the Turanian coast side. And this is what's known as the Mignano Gap. So the road comes from here down through this valley here, around here. This is Highway 6, the Via Casalina, the ancient Roman road, the Via Casalina. And this is Monte Sammucro, 3,000 feet high. Over there is Monte Camino, also about 3,000 feet high. And the reason you have to, and the reason you can't get through here until you've got these two peaks is because up here are German observers. And they can see everything that is moving in this valley. And they can direct artillery fire and mortar fire and machine guns and everything else under the sun onto that road the moment it is used. And it's already been zeroed. And what I mean by that is they've already worked out the coordinates of where to fire their guns before they get there. So there is no way you can send the Allies through there until you've taken these peaks either side. And that's just a really horrendous job. And the problem is you need that road because they're highly mechanised. And there's no way you can get a truck over this mountain or a tank or anything like that. The only thing that can go up there is a mule and an infantryman. So you've got a massive job on your hand. Here is Monte Camino. And actually it's the Guards Brigade from the 56th Division which attacked this in the first half of November. And they don't get very far. And look at them. These are the Grenadier Guards after they've come off Camino. I mean, look at the exhaustion on this guy's face or on his face. I mean, it is. I remember looking at this for the first time and just thinking, oh my God. Okay, I understand now how tough that fight was. And this is the problem. And even on the Adriatic coast, again, lots of mountains. It's not quite as mountainous, but once you get off there's Foggia. This is where all the airfields are, and there's this bottom right here. but you're very quickly getting up into the hills again, even when you're on the coastline. And lots of rivers. And where there's mountains, there's always rivers. And the river's always trying to get to the sea as quickly as possible, which is at 90 degrees to the advance that you're trying to make up the leg. So it's just, these are the conditions in which you're trying to fight. And I can't even begin to stress enough just how difficult it is. You know, in high summer, you've got no problem. You can move all this stuff whenever you like. When you've got 6 inches of mud or a foot of mud, it just changes everything. And it means that you're down to crawling pace. This is the advance to across the other side of the River Sangro. Here's the Sangro here. Montgomery, commander of 8th Army, you know, he originally plans to cross the Sangro on the night of the 19th, 20th. It pours of rain. So then they do some bridging, get some some advanced troops, patrols over the other side, and they plan to do the next attack on the 23rd. Absolute torrential downpours. The 50-yard wide Sangro grows to 350 yards. So you can forget that. That doesn't happen. Finally, it's dry enough by the 27th, 28th of November. Beautiful sunny day and dry. The river shrunk again. They get across. Allied air forces are able to go in at full strength, and the whole German 65th Infantry Division is basically completely destroyed. And then it starts to rain again. So they're back to square one. And, you know, they're fighting over this kind of terrain here. This is Ausonia on the distance here. I mean, that is incredibly difficult terrain over which to fight, because you get to the top of the hill, you clear the Germans off it, then you've got to go down again. They're on the next hill. You've got to take that ridge. Then you go down another ridge, up onto another, down into another valley, and so it goes on. And behind them, there's a sort of whole host of mountains. And this is the River Morrow. There's Ortona in the distance. This is what they're trying to get at the beginning of December. This is where they are on the night of the 5th and the 6th of December, when they firstly start launching that attack against Ortona and the Germans there. Meanwhile, the Strategic Air Forces are gearing up to move to Foggia. The 15th Air Force is created on the 1st of November 1943, and they then decide that actually, instead of sending 6 bomb groups over to Foggia, they're going to send 21. And again, this has to compete with the land forces for the limited supply net sources that they've got, the logistic chain that they've got. And even when they do get there, it's flooded and it's a nightmare. And actually, the Strategic Air Forces operating out of Foggia don't really get going until about March 1944, because it's just too cloudy, it's too wet, it's too miserable, it's too everything. But interestingly, by the 25th of November, United States engineers have created a fuel pipeline from the coast to Foggia, 20 miles, which is capable of carrying 160,000 gallons of high octane fuel every single day. I mean, that is an incredible engineering feat. But again, it comes at a cost, and the cost is to the PBI, the poor bloody infantry here having to do the slog through this. And here they are, the Guards up again, and 56th Division battling through Camino again in the first half of December. And the Texans going up onto Monte Sammucro. This is Monte Sammucro, as you can see. I mean, that rock is a shocker, because, you know, when a shell lands on the beaches of Dunkirk, it's got somewhere to absorb the explosion. Up there, it's got nowhere. So the destructive effect of the shrapnel on that area is huge, but it's exacerbated by the blasting of razor-sharp bits of rock as well. It's a horror story. It's very windy up there. It's very exposed. The Texans attack on the night of the 15th, 16th of December up there, and they're doing so in moonlight, in the middle of the night, in the middle of December, on a 3,000-foot mountain. I mean, it's incredible. And as I say, there's bits of shrapnel absolutely everywhere up there. It's absolutely extraordinary when you get up there. I mean, look at that. That's just, it's beautiful to be there now, but not in December. This is the valley. This is Sammucro on the right-hand side. This is the village of San Pietro under attack, under Italian fire. This is the road leading into it, a knocked-out Sherman tank. And this is the village of San Pietro, which nestles on the side of Monte Sammucro, above, overlooking the Via Casalina, the Mignano Gap. And it was an absolutely beautiful village, untouched in centuries. I mean, just the fabric of life, the rhythms of the seasons, just absolutely one followed the other, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, until the war came and completely destroyed it. And this is Rosa Fuoco, and most of the villagers were actually had dug themselves caves under a kind of little cliff face on the western side of the village. And they couldn't, the battle changed, and so they couldn't get to the stream and get water. They were all absolutely parched. And on the early hours of the 14th December, a load of them heard that there was a cistern on the far other side of the village, which still had some water in them, which hadn't been polluted by the Germans. And so a number of them went off with pails to try and get some water. And they were on their way back when first light came. And the Americans, who were just on the other side of the village, saw these figures moving around and thought they were Germans and opened fire. And she was discovered there on the morning of the 17th, where she'd lain ever since she was shot on the 14th. And this is the spot where she was, just here, literally just here. And that's the church still in ruins, and this is the village, just never been lived in again. It's absolutely tragic. And when you go there, it's so moving, I can't tell you. You wander around all these ruined homes and covered in ivy and trees growing up there and stuff. Never lived in again. A whole village, way of life just gone forever in that battle. And that's the cost of fighting in Italy. And I'm going to finish, and I'm sorry I've overrun a little bit, but I'm going to finish with this slide, which is the memorial by the Canadians in the middle of Ortona. And it's in a big square. And what really struck me when I first saw it is this is no celebration of war. This is absolutely commemoration rather than celebration. And it's no glorification either. This is a medic lying over a wounded Canadian. And it just speaks volumes of they're Canadians, but they could be German really. And it speaks volumes of the scale of the destruction there in that one little town. It became known as the Stalingrad of the Adriatic, although largely forgotten now. And one of the things that I was originally, when I started this book, I was planning to do till the fall of Rome in June 1944. And I was halfway through it and I thought, I'm just not doing this justice. I'm thinking I ought to hustle through all this bit because I need to get to the juicy stuff of Cassino and Anzio and the fall of Rome. And I thought, do you know what? No, I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to commemorate this properly, because these guys all thought their lives was every bit as valuable as someone who was killed on D-Day. Of course it was. And as I stood there on looking at that, I felt really choked up, because I was sort of thinking, I'd just come out of the museum there and I'd seen lots of pictures of destruction and blown up houses and blackened corpses and blackened hulls of tanks. And this was October last year, and so just about 11, 12 months ago. And of course, the guns were still firing in Ukraine, and the pictures were exactly the same. And I just remember thinking, God, do we ever learn? And sadly, seems like we never do. So on that jolly note, I'm going to end. But all I'd just say is this is, of all the books I've done, this has been, I thought the Brothers in Arms one, I got very sort of involved in that one emotionally. But this one really has been incredibly moving, largely because it's so unknown, and yet the scale of this escalating violence and awfulness is just so shocking. It really is, and it sort of deserves to be better known, I think. Thank you.